You started to get into, what I would call sort of underwriting and maybe even compliance by design. I'm curious when you approach, that particular set of things in an environment where, in a lot of ways, the rules are still being written and policy still being written. How do you manage that? Where again, you're sort of building, a system that you also are seeing the rules of the road sort of also coming into view and being assessed at the same time. So I'm just curious how you've navigated that, and then also what your sense is of everything that's going on related to that.
Yeah, it's an important point because as you evolve as a company, you start to have more to lose and less to gain. And you don't want to fall into that trap of becoming so overly concerned that you can't actually innovate. So when you first start, right, you're like, okay, well, this doesn't work. It doesn't really matter because we don't have anything at all. But as you get bigger, you naturally are going to become more risk averse, which is okay, but you want to push against that too. And so the approach that I've typically taken here is, and honestly, AI tools are a wonder for this, is to really push on the regulation. I think just going back to that underwriting example we just gave, similarly in compliance, there's a lot of suggestions that ultimately boil down to, well, this is how we did it here or there. This is how JP Morgan does it, right? There's a lot of people who think like that. And it's not necessarily bad, but if you're trying to change the status quo, you have to think differently. And so I think getting much closer to the actual regulations and understanding not only what they say, but the context in which they were written is really valuable. And trying to push on something like that is how you bring innovation. And usually that has to come, founder, CEO down. You're not going to really, or somebody acting in that position, right? It's not going to come bottoms up.
And regulation is a very pernicious thing, right? Because it's very rare that you see it reassessed over time longitudinally. It just sort of like adds. It's like paper mache. You just kind of keep adding more and more layers, and it becomes really complex. I'm curious though, if you were to sort of go back in a time machine and be able to say, let's rethink this one kind of component of financial regulation from a historical context. Maybe the one that comes up and feels like, maybe the hardest thing to kind of wrap new legislation or new regulation around. What would that be, out of curiosity, in your mind?
I would probably say the securities regulation. I mean, securities are working well, but constantly there's just a lot of burden for companies to go public, and just this broad framework around investor education and compliance and sort of what we've seen with the private market. I think there's, so much boom and innovation in the private market that people haven't been exposed to because fundamentally the requirements to be a public company are big. And then also the way that private companies can sell to regular investors is also really limited. And so what's happening is you kind of have those two things working together such that a lot of innovation and wealth creation is not available to a lot of other people, which seems like like a very fundamental problem. I wouldn't say that in my career, that's been the number one problem that I've experienced. I would focus more on things like some of the consumer finance, truth in lending, those type of things that have been more of a nuisance because I think a lot of times you're not, I mean, some parts of the regulation are good, but some parts of the implementation, I think, are not necessarily resulting in outcomes that the designers of the laws wanted. But I think but broadly, when I just look at financial services and the whole US economy and what's not working, I think that there's probably too little availability for the general public to invest in some of the most interesting companies, and there's a reluctance for those companies to go public. And so I think that's a big solution. That said, or that's a big problem. That said, US capital markets are the envy of the world. And so what we're doing is certainly working better here than anywhere else in the world.
Oh, absolutely. Maybe talking a bit more about tokenization and capital markets, since we sort of started to go down that path. We've really seen some significant momentum, I would say, in tokenized treasuries and early moves into private credit. In your opinion, what's the most misunderstood part of sort of this early set of tokenization and capital markets trends that's out there that you think the general public is not fully watching or aware of?
I think tokenization doesn't necessarily mean liquidity. So that's a big thing, is that just because you tokenize something does not make it liquid. And so going back to the question that you just asked about regulation and what are the opportunities, I think if you look at something like Figure, what we've been able to do on the tokenized private credit side, particularly in mortgage, is create a liquid market. Over 60 billion of the real world assets that we originate have traded. And we've brought liquidity into private credit in a space that hasn't historically done so. And we've done that by homogenizing and standardizing it. And so I think that concept is missed by a lot of people, and they're looking to tokenize. Like, honestly, I mean, treasuries are already relatively liquid and standardized. So it's not as valuable, in my opinion, to tokenize them as it is to do something like private credit. And going back to this whole capital markets thing, equities, if you look at the history of them, it used to be much more nowhere near as standardized. And there's like the evolution of the exchanges and all these rules. And yes, there is opportunity. But when I think about where is there more opportunity, I really think private credit is one of the best places, because you have this huge asset class that has many of the same attributes as things like equities or commodities, but it doesn't have that standardization. And that's why Figure is so focused on that space and trying to bring liquidity. Not We are tokenizing, but we're not just tokenizing for the sake of tokenization.